Once upon a time, within FromSoftware's offices, word came around that the conceptualization of a high fantasy game was hitting nothing but dead ends. Hidetaka Miyazaki decided to step in and take over. Considering the fact that many people within the company were already considering the project a failure, Miyazaki knew he could basically make any game he wished because even if it did fail, no one would have been surprised. It was a highly risky game to make on FromSoftware's part, as they were mostly known for Armored Core at the time, and for Kingsfield what seemed like a lifetime ago. They even pitched an early build to Sony, and Shuhei Yoshida himself called the game crap, a move he would later admit was a grave mistake. Undeterred, Miyazaki and team launched the game, and while it didn't burn down the house financially, it did more than well enough to be called a success, including in the eyes of reviewers and players. Demon's Souls released on the PlayStation 3 in 2009, as a niche dark fantasy game that, to the average passerby that knew nothing of the game, seemed like run-of-the-mill AA Japanese jank trying to beat Elder Scrolls or something. But upon closer examination, it quickly developed interest due to its rewarding yet punishing combat, enthralling world and lore, palpable atmosphere, gorgeous music, clever level design, and eye-catching art design in spite of a fairly lackluster level of visual fidelity. It successfully cultivated a following that not only helped guarantee the risky game's success, but also stayed loyal to carry that success over to its spiritual successor, Dark Souls, released 2 years later for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and eventually the PC. Not only did Dark Souls see similar, or greater in fact, critical success, it also saw an immense improvement in financial success too. People who played its predecessor largely considered Dark Souls to be a remarkable follow-up that managed to take everything that worked before and make it even better, including the interconnected Metroidvania-like map that made most areas seamlessly transition into each other. After directing 2 Souls games in a row, Miyazaki stepped aside to work on something else, handing the directing reins of Dark Souls 2 over to Tomohiro Shibuya, who would later be unceremoniously removed from production late in the process, leaving his replacement, Yui Tanimura, to salvage what was left of the project in about a year prior to launch. In 2014, Dark Souls 2 released to critical praise, though shy of what the previous game received. Sadly, the long-awaited sequel's turbulent development interfered with the quality of the final product, and Tanimura received an unjust amount of blame for it, because most people did not yet know of Shibuya's supposed mismanagement. Despite all its issues, Dark Souls 2 still has its own significant share of loyal players and defenders, including me, and it clearly boasted an ambition to be bigger and grander than the last 2 Souls games, though that ambition would sadly go unrealized. However, it was able to regain some interest thanks to its comparatively impressive DLC expansions, the Lost Crowns trilogy. Miyazaki finally showed back up in 2015 with Bloodborne, a heavily Lovecraftian Victorian-era fantasy game that featured what many consider the greatest art design, atmosphere, and general production value seen in the Souls franchise thus far. It wasn't a Souls game in name, obviously, but it very, very clearly took almost every single gameplay element over from them. The game was nothing short of a smash hit. It was a critical darling with sales numbers that surpassed Sony's expectations, and is currently known as probably the best exclusive to grace the PlayStation 4. And yet, FromSoftware would still go for the 1-2 punch by releasing Dark Souls 3 only a year later, in 2016. Closing out the series, 3 sought to bring a definitive end to the Age of Souls, featuring a grander scale than what had ever been achieved before. To no one's surprise, it was also a success in every way that counts. Looking back on it from there, FromSoftware came through in crafting a series that actually managed to grow in popularity and critical adoration on a mostly game-to-game basis. In the span of only 7 years, they went from a niche Japanese studio that most people wouldn't have recognized to one of the biggest names in the industry and one of the most admired studios in the world of RPGs. In 2019, they would deviate a bit with Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice, a stealth action game that, while not a Souls game, and I will argue with you on this, it still took a few key mechanics from the franchise, including an Estus Flask-like healing function and bonfire-like checkpoints. It was a different breed of game for people who only knew the company from Souls games, but it still managed just as much critical and commercial acclaim, taking home award after award at the end of the year. However, little did we know, while we were all playing Sekiro, losing ourselves to the countless attempts at beating Sword Saint Ishin, FromSoftware's true successor to the Dark Souls mantle was waiting to be revealed. Their biggest, most expensive, and most ambitious game to date would be revealed that summer. Elden Ring. It debuted at E3 2019, featuring little to no details about its world and no gameplay to speak of. But it had FromSoftware's name attached to it, as well as Miyazaki's and George R.R. Martin? Yeah, the creator of A Song of Ice and Fire was involved, tasked with writing the world's lore. Of course, this prompted many people to make jokes about the game never coming out, but everyone should know that George finishes everything he does that isn't titled The Winds of Winter. Anyway, the CG trailer sent people into a tailspin of hype. It showed almost nothing of substance, admittedly, but FromSoftware had such an incredible track record of quality that everyone was ready and willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. Sadly, a worldwide pandemic eventually struck, and we heard nothing of the game at all for 2 full years, when it was then re-announced with a release date that was mere months away, and more details than ever were beginning to come out. The most fascinating of all being the simple fact that the game was open world. A true open world, as opposed to the Metroidvania-style interconnected stages that every game under the Soulsborne banner had abided by. Needless to say, everyone's interest had peaked. But the time has now come. Elden Ring is finally here, and many of us have been playing it, including me. I've finished my initial playthrough, and it's time to cease the history lesson and begin the review proper. So join me as I recall my journey of becoming the next Elden Lord. Elden Ring takes place in the majestic but torn Lands Between, which has undergone catastrophic change in the form of the Shattering. Someone has destroyed the Elden Ring, an immensely powerful object that gives strength to the Erd Tree, a gargantuan, luminous tree that stretches above the clouds and gives life to the world around it. With the Elden Ring shattered into multiple pieces kept by the children of Queen Marika, the reigning sovereign of the land, the player, controlling an unnamed Tarnished, which are those who were once exiled, must seek the pieces out and rejoin them to bring peace back to the Lands Between. Or perhaps not. Dark Souls was known for its very cryptic storytelling, with world-building being told entirely through bits and pieces of each game's minimalist dialogue and item descriptions. While this method of delivering exposition is truly fascinating when done correctly, sometimes the mystery of certain details left things a bit more clouded than some would like. Elden Ring's core story, however, feels clearer and more concise, but without sacrificing that drip-feed world-building that many have come to love and appreciate. The flavor of the lore and backstories of major characters is palpable, though not all of it is front and center for the player to find with ease. The incredible detail is still always there, waiting to shed more light on the enigmas of the Lands Between and the demigods who rule over it. It's a little difficult to go into more detail without either diving into speculation or simply spoiling major plot points, because even though FromSoft's method of storytelling is so minimalist, their games are still more than capable of hitting the player with crucial surprise reveals or clever subversion of expectations. I will say though, it absolutely feels like George R.R. Martin's contributions have not impacted the game in any negative capacity when compared to the writing of other Souls games. His contributions make up most, if not all, of the foundation of the universe the game sets itself on, and I think he's done a fantastic job. It truly feels like he was firing on all cylinders when crafting this world. According to Miyazaki, George's involvement was intended to hopefully make a less vague plot that's more accessible to potential first-time players of Souls games, and I think this goal was accomplished. And this world lends itself incredibly well to FromSoft's strong sense of art direction. Compared to Souls games of the past, Elden Ring's setting looks and feels more fantastical than anything that came prior, and its mystical atmosphere and design evokes a sense of wonderment that few other games, RPGs or otherwise, have managed to touch. Environments range from gorgeous and comforting to bleak and moody to confounding and otherworldly, and every other type of aesthetic and feeling in between. The world truly feels fully realized when you gaze toward the horizon and see awe-striking landmarks that are probably several in-game kilometers away. It's a level of fantasy majesty that immerses the player immediately upon entering the open world proper. It's a well-thought-out and carefully crafted setting with incredible detail and personality. Traversing this magnificent setting is also made easy and convenient thanks to a spectral steed named Torrent that you get early on, and the ability to jump without needing a running start, unlike past Souls games. Enemy designs are similarly impressive. It's a hard task to stuff any AAA RPG with an adequate amount of enemy variety. Some of them fall embarrassingly short of the task, but Souls games have always managed to place unique enemies where it counted, while also sparingly duplicating certain enemies where most people would be fine with. Obviously, there's some exceptions to this, like Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith, but FromSoft's been pretty reliable in crafting a respectable bestiary overall. Elden Ring shines even brighter in this regard, because not only did the developers create a shockingly massive map for players to explore, they went above and beyond to populate it with an incredible library of foes. There's badass knights, oppressive spellcasters, horrific monstrosities, mystical animals, golems and living statues, ghosts and spirits, intimidating dragons, and more. This leads me into the game's graphics and performance. Now, this is where the first of few criticisms comes in. I played the native PlayStation 5 version, not the PlayStation 4 version on PS5. As one may come to expect nowadays, the game features two graphical performance modes, one prioritizing resolution and another prioritizing frame rate. I switched back and forth between them for a bit and found that the mode favoring resolution did not boast enough of a difference to justify the 30 frame per second lock, so I stuck with the frame rate mode for the rest of my playthrough. Normally this is where I would praise a game for rock solid 60 FPS performance, but sadly, that's not going to happen here. One thing that was made apparent prior to launch by people who are well versed in technical performance of games, such as Digital Foundry, is that the PS5 version's frame rate mode leaves some things to be desired, and a consistent 60 is one of them. Elden Ring, despite being originally made with previous generation consoles in mind, unfortunately cannot hold that sought-after, locked 60 frames per second. The somewhat good news is that the game does generally stay above the 45 FPS mark at the very least, so it's not all that bad. It's still perfectly acceptable, and some might not even notice a difference. A more difficult thing to ignore, however, is when traveling around the open world, texture pop-in is fairly prevalent, especially when you're looking at the ground. Grass and high-resolution textures suddenly switch in pretty frequently when you're riding around. It's hard to miss and can sometimes be pretty severe. I don't want to be so strict on the game's performance, but I would have expected a bit better for a game that was originally announced only for PS4 and Xbox One. I can't help but wonder if the game's engine is just not optimized for an experience of this scale, which would be perfectly understandable because this is without a doubt FromSoft's biggest title yet, and considering the incredible density of assets in the environment and far draw distances when out in the open world, it honestly could be worse. Still, I hope their next game, whatever it may be, performs a bit better. On the more optimistic side of things, if there's one big compliment that I can give any open world game with a massive map and grand ambitions, it's a comment on a lack of bugs. It's hard to come across a game with a huge world that doesn't have its fair share of odd glitches, ranging from benign and amusing to bordering on progress blocking. But Elden Ring has a distinct absence of these issues, aside from occasional odd AI behavior, of course, which usually straightens itself out or isn't that much of a problem to begin with. In my entire playthrough, I have encountered no bugs whatsoever that are worth mentioning as particularly bad. I never fell through the game's geometry, I was never stuck in a spot where the only way to free myself was death, and all quest-related NPCs functioned normally. I'm not saying bugs don't exist, I'm just saying that I managed to go from beginning to end without running into any that were really major, and that's pretty damn astounding for a game of this size. Then there's the loading times. As we've come to expect, the PS5 version of Elden Ring is much like others in regard to blazingly fast loading. Whenever I start the game from the main menu or fast travel to a previously visited Grace site from any other Grace, it never takes more than 5 or 6 seconds. In some cases, it takes as little as 3 or 4. The speed of the SSD continues to impress even over a year into the console's lifespan. And believe me, in case you aren't playing the game already, you're gonna want every second saved so you can put them all back into actual gameplay. Unfortunately, that's also the extent to which the PS5's hardware is truly utilized. Elden Ring sadly lacks interesting haptic feedback usage as well as impressive 3D audio. It's obviously not integral to the overall experience, and the game isn't any worse for the lack of it either. But it does make me think back to the Demon's Souls remake, which featured awesome implementations of both. The lack of 3D audio also doesn't mean the sound design is dull. The sound effects are as powerful and lively as ever. As the music is also gorgeous and gripping. Souls games tend to boast some powerful original scores, and Elden Ring does not deviate from expectations in this regard. Music featured in the major areas of the open world are heavy on ambiance, so they're immersive without being distracting. Legacy dungeons, which are main dungeon levels of the game, also have some grim, foreboding tunes to adequately evoke a sense of danger and dreariness, or an appropriate amount of mystery and mysticism. Meanwhile, major battle themes, especially boss fights, often tout loud, bombastic, and adrenaline-pumping instrumentals. You're not just fighting a threateningly dangerous foe, you're also fighting the music's marketability in creating a sense of urgency that makes the encounter feel more intimidating than it already is. Pounding percussion, droning strings, ominous choirs, Elden Ring's soundtrack has strength equal to the game's art and scope. Now it's time to dive into the core of the game, the meat and potatoes, the gameplay. As you might expect, there's a lot to discuss here, so let's go over things one at a time, starting with combat. If you've played a Souls game, any of them, before, then you know what to expect, because, frankly, Elden Ring is a Souls game in every way except the name. If you haven't played a Souls game before, then I'll give you a brief overview. You have a left-handed and right-handed weapon, you attack or block with them using their respective trigger buttons, and you can perform dodge rolls at the right moment to get out of harm's way thanks to the invincibility frames that begin on the first frame of the animation. Every action you do in combat is dictated by the green stamina bar in the top left of the screen, including casting spells. That green line is the gameplay's heart, and you will probably be keeping an eye on it far more often than you will your health bar right above it. Elden Ring, exactly like its predecessors, has a system where patience is key, and risky moves or greedy aggression will often get you harshly punished unless you truly know what you're doing. Of course, not every Souls game played the exact same way. Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 2, and to a lesser extent Dark Souls 1 are notable for being pretty slow in comparison to the much faster action of Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. The latter two were still Souls games at heart, obviously, but the increase in combat speed and greater focus of aggression that came with that might have left a bit of a sour taste in the mouths of players who prefer the feeling of the older games. And honestly, that includes me. I have a lot of love and admiration for certain aspects of Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, but their combat never clicked with me as much as the combat for Demons, Dark 1, and Dark 2. One of my biggest hopes for Elden Ring was that it would reinvigorate my love of Souls gameplay by striking that balance somewhere between the extremes. It seemed like a tall order after being disappointed by 3 games in a row, including Sekiro, so I wasn't really holding my breath. But I'm extremely happy to say that Elden Ring did it. It relit the bonfire in my heart that made me love Souls-style combat. According to Souls content creator Zuli the Witch, Elden Ring's astounding boss fight count stands at a monumental 170, including open world bosses, dungeon bosses, and story bosses. That's a number you don't expect for a single player game. What's more is that 70 of those bosses are completely unique, which, again, is a number that is not often seen. FromSoft's talented art and combat design team worked overtime in every direction, and it shows. Of course, that does mean an extra 100 of those bosses are recycled, but even then it's not always a straight copy-paste, as some of them are given different weapons from their counterparts, which means different movesets to deal with. FromSoft's thoughtful implementations of these bosses means that the majority of the unique encounters are saved for big and often story-related moments, while the duplicates are saved mostly for optional dungeons or open-world boss fights. So the duplicating doesn't feel as obvious or egregious as, say, Sekiro. Elden Ring sports a fantastic level of pacing in fights that truly feels like it allows the player to assess the situation and respond appropriately with whatever method they choose, usually. Obviously, with a game so massive and a selection of enemies that trumps most other RPGs, not every one is going to feel perfectly balanced. Generally speaking, a vast majority do feel fine, sometimes even great. But occasionally you'll get a boss that's so aggressive you wonder if it's even possible to reliably put some distance between the two of you to even get a magic spell out. If combat has one consistent issue that I've come across in my time as a boring, sword and board melee-only knight, it's that some bosses are simultaneously so offensive and also so well-rounded in their moveset that they have a response for every possible thing I can do, and I had to accept that if I wanted to get my own offense in, I would have to deal with a very high chance of trading hits almost every time. That happened on more than one occasion, and it's probably why Margit the Fell Omen was such a wall for people early in the game. That bastard has a counter for a player who is at any distance away and from any angle. He can even change his attacks mid-combo to adjust to those proximities too. In rare instances, it felt like certain bosses just refused to allow me my turn to attack, no matter how much I waited or dodged. Hence, the likelihood of a hit trade if I decide to go in. But honestly, Margit's not even that big of a deal compared to others, as he's simply both a skill check and equipment check in equal measure. A few other encounters throughout the game are, to put it bluntly, pretty egregious. There's a specific boss fight archetype that I've found to be an increasingly prevalent problem in recent Souls games, and it seems to come to a head in Elden Ring. Enemies who are so physically gigantic that their whole body cannot reliably stay within the frame of the screen, which in turn obscures their long dramatic attack animations. I would kill to simply have the camera zoom out a little bit on these fights. And to make matters worse, despite their size, some are also extremely mobile and constantly move and jump around, which makes a significant portion of the fight just chasing them down and repositioning yourself. Fights like this can be nothing short of a hassle for melee-focused builds, and just makes the experience feel a bit clunky overall. And, as the cherry on top, some of these bosses are also confined to an arena that is far too small for them, which makes half the battle against the camera. In this case, I am looking at ulcerated and putrid tree spirits. The only way these guys could have been worse is if they had full-body hitboxes that damaged you for simply pressing up against them as they writhed around, so at least the absence of that nonsense is honestly appreciated. There's also multi-boss encounters, aka gank fights, where there's 2, occasionally 3, enemies to defeat at once. This isn't too huge of an issue by itself. Multi-enemy bosses have been a thing since man-eaters in Demon's Souls. They typically can be manageable with patience and good kiting. But then some of them have gimmicks on top of that, such as all 3 bosses being able to afflict you with scarlet rot. Thanks, Crystallians. Fortunately, encounters like these are limited in number and tend to be kept exclusively to optional dungeons, but man, they are not great and are absolutely the closest the game comes to being a chore. Now, some of you might be thinking, if the bosses are so aggressive and you don't like faster combat in Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne, or they're simply too gimmicky, then why are you enjoying Elden Ring? That's a fair question, and I have an answer. A couple, in fact. The thing is, Elden Ring actually seems keenly aware of how fast or gimmicky some fights can be compared to the capability of some builds, and offers a plethora of ways to close the gap between you and your enemy by allowing methods of creating your own opportunities to attack. One is the strength of status effects. In a lot of RPGs, status effects are usually things that only the player has to worry about, because they're meant to pose an extra threat to you instead of being a tool you can rely on for your own usage. They're a one-way mechanic in that manner. It's pretty rare for an RPG to allow status effects to destroy enemies and bosses as easily as they destroy the player. But Elden Ring's clear intention of teaching combat pragmatism makes it one of those games. Bleed and Frostbite are clear winners here, as a lot of people currently playing have demonstrated, because they allow for ridiculous damage stacking. Scarlet Rot is also noteworthy as a form of super poison, kind of like Plague in previous Souls games. FromSoft finally nailed status effects as a two-way mechanic, where the player has to worry about getting them, but also gets to utilize them with just as much efficiency for themselves. Then we can couple that with the effectiveness of Ashes of War. Weapon arts in Dark Souls 3 just seem flaccid and uninteresting in comparison to the Ashes of War in Elden Ring, which look significantly more flashy and epic and feel that way too, even if they might not be in actual utility. Many of them allow for huge, sweeping arcs or radial AoEs to deal with multiple enemies. They're fun to incorporate into fights, and it's totally viable to center an entire build around them because effective usage can decimate stronger enemies. But arguably even more effective than afflicting your foes with illness or hitting them with big Ashes of War skills is summons. And no, I'm not talking about fellow players you summon via summon signs for jolly cooperation. I'm talking about Ashes, a brand new mechanic that allows you to summon NPCs at absolutely any time you're in proximity to a rebirth monument, which are present all around the open world, in dungeons, and in the vast majority of boss fights. NPC summons range from regular trash mobs like imps, archers, and wolves, they are very good boys, to extremely powerful named warriors like Ludel the Headless, Banished Knight Oleg, and Omen Killer Rollo. What's more is that these summons are upgradable, meaning you can talk to a specific NPC to make them more powerful and last longer in battle. The best summons in the game can last entire endgame boss fights once fully upgraded, and in some cases can defeat the boss on their own. It's incredible. However, the one that truly holds a special place in my heart and has been joining me at every single battle where I'm allowed to summon him is me. There's a mimic summon that takes the form of yourself, copying your appearance, equipment, and your stats, but with a massive HP increase and unlimited FP, meaning theoretically infinite Ash of War spam. It's insane. It's these small, tanky beasts that make even the most aggravatingly aggressive bosses tolerable. Do summons have the potential to absolutely trivialize boss fights? Yes, without a doubt. But do I care? No, not in the slightest, because it's fun. I will never, ever get tired of mercilessly bullying a boss with Hoarfrost stomp spam from myself and my summon. It's hilarious. I thoroughly enjoy it every single time. I'm sure some people who come up with their own arbitrary house rules on what can be considered legitimate play will be displeased at the abuse of a mechanic that the game itself tries to pound into your head to use, but I will never stop, because it's too goddamn entertaining. Overpowered tools and resources are typically fun to use in almost any game, and Elden Ring, despite being a game centered around offering a challenge, understands this too, and doesn't shy away from offering such powerful options out of fear of losing its edge. They're often given to you as a reward for exploring well beyond what the main story requires, which is exactly how an open-world game should reward you. Summons also help immensely for people who want to play slowly and defensively without the pressure of being forced into aggression and speed by the enemy. The player is given more influence over the pace of the fight, which is the crux of why I wasn't super into Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3, because those games felt like they truly couldn't help but try to nudge me towards being light and offensive if I wanted the best chance at survival. But at least Bloodborne's approach to that felt a bit more natural, whereas Dark Souls 3's just came off as an identity crisis where it couldn't decide if it wanted to be Dark Souls 3 or Bloodborne 1.5. Oh, and there's also a very small amount of stealth mechanics in this game too, no doubt brought over from Sekiro. Elden Ring allows crouch walking to easier sneak up on enemies for that opening backstab, and some items assist in keeping your noise levels low too. It's not a very in-depth stealth system, but it does what it's meant to do. And as a part of combat, there's the arsenal, weapons, and spells, and there's quite an impressive selection. According to Fextralife's count, there's a grand total of 309 weapons spread across 31 weapon types, including but not limited to straight swords, great swords, colossal weapons, axes, bows, crossbows, claws, fists, flails, daggers, katanas, and even torches. Yes, torches. There's multiple types of torches in this game. The catalog of weaponry at your disposal is gargantuan, with their own strengths and perks. There's common weapons that you can find pretty much anywhere or simply purchase from a merchant for cheap, and there's unique weapons that boast their own equally unique Ashes of War, and a lot of them feel very, very viable, especially with clever infusing, which is another point to touch on. In previous Souls games, infusing a weapon involved finding a material that would imbue a special status and its appropriate attribute scaling for additional power. For example, you would need to find a stone to turn a longsword, which scales with strength and dex, into a magic longsword, which now scales slightly less with strength and dex, but now scales a lot more with intelligence, and does magic damage on top of that too, with a higher total attack rating compared to a non-infused longsword. This process was needlessly archaic and confusing in Demon Souls, and only slightly less so in Dark Souls 1, before finally being simplified as much as possible without sacrificing customization in Dark Souls 2, arguably the best thing that game did right and doesn't get enough credit for. But Elden Ring manages to surpass even that. Here, you don't need a new material at all. In order to change a weapon's effect, damage type, and respective scaling attributes, you simply need to equip a new Ashes of War, and infusion automatically happens. When I put Hoarfrost Stomp on a longsword, it then becomes a cold longsword with all of the perks that come with that, and it's free. It costs nothing to put an Ash of War you already own onto a weapon, and you can remove it and reapply it as much as you want. You can switch the Ash of War for a single weapon over and over as you progress through one legacy dungeon if you so desire. And before you ask, you actually don't need to be stuck with the scaling the Ash of War automatically gives you. If you're in possession of the appropriate Whetblade key item, you can select a different scaling type with the new Ashes of War you're imbuing. So if I want Hoarfrost Stomp, but want a magic longsword instead of cold for better scaling, I can do that. Furthermore, you can also spend a very rare resource if you want to duplicate an Ash of War so multiple weapons can have it. It's a system that is easy to use and easy to understand and still keeps the weapon modification we know and love from Souls games. Plus, it's a system that immediately puts a ton more value and utility on a weapon you might otherwise not stick with for long, especially because it doesn't negate any natural status effects the weapon might have, like bleed on katanas. And as the cherry on top, it's a system that doesn't force you to stick to a weapon you don't like just for its Ash of War. It opens up a whole new world of equipment freedom. Furthermore, weapon upgrades now go all the way up to a massive plus 25 instead of the usual plus 10, and it's paced surprisingly evenly with exploration and progression across the map and through the story. If you do your due diligence and adequately clear out your surroundings whenever you enter a new area, you're very likely to naturally end up with, or close to, a plus 25 weapon when you hit the end credits of the game. The increase in that number of levels is also appropriate for the sheer size of the game, which we'll discuss in more detail in a bit. Going into spells, there's a bit worth touching on here as well. First, Elden Ring retains the existence of the FP meter, which debuted in Demon's Souls but disappeared until it came back in Dark Souls 3. Typically, Souls games only have two attributes that are tied to magic-based weapon and spell requirements: intelligence and faith. Intelligence is usually related to sorceries, faith to miracles, pyromancy to neither, and in Dark Souls 2's case, both are related to hexes together. Elden Ring takes all of these and mixes them up a bit. Intelligence is still mostly tied to sorcery and faith to miracles, now called incantations, but stronger spells in either category may also require investment in an additional stat, arcane, which, as an attribute, also affects item discovery, holy defense, and vitality. Spells in Elden Ring have just as much of a massive library as weapons, 171 spells in total by my own personal count, though I might be missing some. Obviously, not all spells are at the same level of usefulness and utility. Some are pretty decent, some are worthless, and some are just plain incredible, assuming you can freely spend the FP. Much like Ashes of War, the best spells look and feel epic, like you're truly playing a main character in a fantasy setting, ranging anywhere from simple single shots that do a meager amount of damage to summoning forth cataclysmic meteors that can obliterate groups of trash mobs, to healing and buffing spells for yourself and your allies. There's a spell for every situation, and at every level of commitment to being a caster, making it easy to keep some good offensive spells even if you're still mostly melee focused with only a small investment in magic. There's also awesome dragon spells that temporarily transforms your character into a dragon to spew magic breath, fire breath, or rot breath to inflict big damage and status effects. The magical arsenal of Elden Ring is extensive as it is superb. They're flashy, they hit hard, and above all else, they're fun to use. Next, we have Talismans, which are Elden Ring's replacement for, well, rings. In Souls games, rings played a huge part in deciding the foundation of your build and strengthening it, because rings were the piece of gear that gave a straight benefit, buff, or stat increase that would make some of them essential for your current character. They would do anything from increasing maximum HP or FP, increasing stamina regen, making your footsteps silent, increasing status effect defenses, or lowering fall damage, which is already pretty generous in Elden Ring, comparable to Demon's Souls, to more powerful effects like giving you lifesteal, increasing several attributes at once, or dramatically increasing attack power the lower your equip load is. In some cases, the set of rings you choose to put on your character could make or break a build. This importance is about as equally as highlighted in Elden Ring's Talismans, due to their potential benefits making some almost mandatory depending on how you're playing. However, with the power and utility of Ashes of War and spells, it's definitely still possible to make a strong character without being so precise in your talisman set. It's still definitely recommended you pick and choose wisely though, because some of those effects are crazy strong and worth going out of your way to grab. The right talismans can make a build even more hyper-specialized, and therefore even more entertaining. Considering the vast selection of weapons, spells, and talismans, it's impressive that Elden Ring makes so many of them feel so viable and worth using. The build variety here is fantastic, which makes the role-playing aspect of this action role-playing game stellar in execution. And finally, we have fashion, or armor sets. and man oh man, this game is pretty strong in this regard too. By my own count, there's 124 armor sets in the game. Again, I could be off by a few. But as far as my eye can see, most of them are pretty damn eye-catching in one way or another. They all seem so intricately designed, and almost every one of them look desirable to put on. The fashion is very strong here. Every Souls game splits their armor into light and heavy, with the former typically providing the best defense against magic and status effects, while the latter often provided the best defense against physical damage, though magic defense was typically good too. With armor sets being divided into chest pieces, hand pieces, leg pieces, and head pieces, it's possible to mix and match to achieve the best weight and defense balance for your character, and style above all else. Because who wouldn't want to look beautiful when decimating your foes? If you wish to be tanky and have lots of poise, you can put on the heaviest stuff you can get. If you desired more finesse, then staying light would be preferred. If you were somewhere in the middle, then achieving a reliable combination of both is possible too. The thing is, people often consider protection offered by armor in Souls games to be largely worthless because enemies can still do big damage to you regardless of what you had on. If anything, you only put on big armor for the poise. I don't know if I agree with that entirely, but even if I did, I don't know if I would consider that a good thing, as it brings up the question of usefulness of armor for practical purposes. Regardless, Elden Ring finally gives us a reason to pay attention to our stats now by straight up telling us the percentage of damage we negate after combining our natural defenses with our armor, buffs, and talisman effects. One valid criticism that the franchise has always received was unnecessary obscurity of what certain stats mean and how they impact gameplay. I vividly recall people thinking the agility stat in Dark Souls 2 was placebo until actual tests were done. And I remember the first several months of Dark Souls 3 having people question if poise actually existed. But Elden Ring at least provides more transparency regarding our survivability thanks to the new negation stat. Oh, and before we move on, there's also the character creator, which is definitely the best one FromSoft has given us so far. Our created characters can look as gorgeous or as hideous as we desire. It's come a long way from Demon Souls character creator where you just looked ugly no matter how hard you tried. And finally, there's the vast, incredible open world of the lands between. Elden Ring represents what can only be considered the new pinnacle of open world design. Dreams of an open world Souls game have been active since the development of Dark Souls 2, which aimed to implement the feature, but a smorgasbord of development issues kept the dream as exactly that. It wasn't until now that FromSoft was able to give it another earnest shot, with Miyazaki and Tanimura co-directing. And the result is this jaw-dropping universe that is more than the sum of its parts. One of the biggest criticisms aimed at a significant amount of open-world titles today is the number of vast empty spaces with nothing to do. Many maps have a dozen or so square kilometers of explorable game area, but only a tiny fraction of that space has anything worth interacting with. In the worst case, these games' open worlds just feel like traversal filler to pad out a game's length. They don't offer any real sense of exploration, there's no interesting spots that draw your attention, and it feels like there's no worthwhile reward for going out of your way to check out an area that's far off the beaten path. One of the most bothersome trends in recent open-world games, particularly games tied to Ubisoft, is icon collecting. Many games are unable to truly evoke a desire within the player to drive themselves forward to explore just for the sake of it. Many games have a map littered with icons that you need to check off, so more of the map is cleared or there's just one less thing to do. Too many open worlds seem like they're incapable of sparking the flame of discovery inside the player's own mind, without having a big arrow at the top of the screen constantly pointing them at the next objective, or an NPC telling them how important it is to do something, or the player character themselves constantly remarking out loud that they should go and check this nearby thing out. Even if that game's world really is fascinating, all of these things just feel like a crutch that the game has to rely on to ensure that the map the developers work so hard on is actually scoured. Elden Ring has none of these weaknesses. The Lands Between is equal parts intriguing, beautiful, and mysterious. FromSoft does not need to constantly pester the player with reminders to look in a certain direction or check out a nearby cave or finish an objective they've been ignoring for hours. This isn't incompetence on their part. It's a bet that they can make a world that's naturally engrossing and can drive the player to set out on an adventure for themselves without using any of the common UI systems, elements, and mechanics that other games rely on. And it's a bet they won. Elden Ring's world is dense with content. You can ride in any direction, starting from any point, and you'll stumble across something interesting and worth taking a detour for every 30 seconds or less. Whether it be the entrance of another dungeon, the ruins of a church that has something useful in it, a unique open-world boss, or a landmark that simply looks cool or important, the game map is stuffed with things to check out. Exploration is entirely player-driven, and there's no better proof of that than seeing a ton of people online play for 10, 20, sometimes 30 hours or more before they even go to Stormvale Castle, which is the first legacy dungeon of the game. Getting lost amidst the countless wonders of the Lands Between is easy, and that's a good thing. None of it is just worthless distractions. The game doesn't just motivate you to go out and explore, it also constantly rewards you for doing so. Every dungeon you clear, every optional boss you defeat, every merchant you find and talk to, every ruin you discover, you're given something that looks important, even if it might not fit with your current build. A weapon, a talisman, an ash of war, a rare crafting or upgrade material, or even a key item in a side quest you haven't even started yet. Elden Ring gives all the right reasons to get your ass on your horse and start investigating. And it's fun the entire time. You don't need to sit and convince yourself to go somewhere because you're not sure if it'll be worth it. You already know it will be. You don't feel pestered by an NPC or obnoxious UI element to prioritize an objective you don't really want to do, because they're not there, and you want to do it anyway. And then there's the unbridled freedom thrown on top of it all. You're allowed to explore a gigantic amount of the Lands Between before you find a path that's blocked by story progress. There's dozens of hours of things to do in the regions you can access from the get-go. And when you're ready to reach those late game areas, you're given almost the exact same amount again. That's not to say that every tiny speck of the map is truly flawless. A lot of dungeons and catacombs feel very samey, for example, in both atmosphere and appearance. But I found myself gleefully diving into them anyway without a second thought because I knew something good was waiting for me at the end. I am not a completionist by any stretch of the imagination. I stop playing a game when I simply feel like stopping, and I never bother with extra challenges or content that seem like more trouble than they're worth. But Elden Ring is masterfully designed to draw out that completionist desire naturally. It's nothing short of absolutely remarkable how FromSoft was able to smartly tackle the approach of this new universe and create a brand new standard of open world design that upcoming games will now be compared to. Overall, Elden Ring is FromSoft's new masterpiece. It looks back on all, or almost all, of the rights and wrongs from previous Souls games and combines the lessons learned into what is the tightest and most epic experience they've made thus far, and on an unprecedented scale that any studio who is even slightly less talented would clumsily trip and fall over. It's an impressive, powerful amalgam of the best aspects of all its predecessors. It boasts a gorgeous world that effortlessly drives you to explore for the sake of it. It features combat that we know and love while adding cool new mechanics that are fun to use. It has characters and lore that are enigmatic and enthralling. It has beautiful music and art direction. And it's simply one of the most satisfying gaming experiences released in the last 10 years or so. Is it a game that's totally without flaws? No, it's not. Performance leaves a lot to be desired. There's a ton of texture and foliage pop-in when out in the open world. Side quests can still be obscured by an unnecessary amount of obtuseness. and some bosses and enemies border on just plain bothersome with gimmicky mechanics or heavy-handed aggression. But I hardly care about those flaws, because this game's heights reach such a monumental peak that few, if any, of its open-world contemporaries have any hope of touching. I don't give number scores in my reviews, as I believe they obscure the nuances and considerations that went into deciding that number. But I'm a firm believer that giving a game a 10 out of 10 doesn't need to imply that the game is perfect. It simply needs to be good enough for that 10 to come to you instinctively and without hesitation or regret. If someone asks me if a game is a 10 out of 10, and I have to pause and seriously think about it, then the answer is probably no. A 10 score is a gut feeling, a sensation where you know you enjoy a game so much you do not question whether or not it's deserving of such a score. You simply know that it is. I don't give number scores in my reviews, but if you asked me if Elden Ring is a 10 out of 10, I would immediately say yes, because that answer is my instinctive response. With the exception of very special circumstances, I cannot imagine myself bothering to ever go back to past Souls titles after experiencing Elden Ring. Yes, they do have their own unique aspects that continue to make them special and distinct from one another, but Elden Ring is just the ideal all-rounder. It scratches almost every conceivable itch that every one of its predecessors does, but with the added bonus of reaching those tricky spots that they haven't. I've effectively been spoiled. Elden Ring has the build variety, the fun tools, the pacing, the awesome world, and the innate sense of exploration that will keep me coming back until FromSoft somehow manages to do even better. Which sounds like an insurmountable task, but if there's any studio that has any conceivable chance of pulling it off, it's them. How this game manages to stay consistently highly investing through dozens of hours of tightly packed content is bordering on a miracle. I've heard someone say that Elden Ring is Dark Souls 4, 5, and 6 all in one, and while that's a bit of an oversimplification, it's accurate in the sense of just how much stuff is in this game. I was stung by the needle of disappointment with Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 in respect to their gameplay, and I was prepared for the chance of feeling it again. But Elden Ring turned it all around with such resounding success, I almost feel foolish for ever having doubts in Miyazaki and Tanimura's leadership to begin with. I love this game, and I am looking forward to seeing how the talented From Software team is going to follow it up. I hope it's with a return from Armored Core. This concludes my review of Elden Ring. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.